We are going to take a look at how Gothic architecture and the ideas behind the 19th century Gothic revival impacted not only the design and technology of the Brooklyn Bridge, but also the bridge's interpretation and significance. Gothic architecture dates back to the 12th century in European history. Knights had traveled to the Holy Land on crusades where they had seen fortresses of the Byzantine Empire. This brought new ideas that would change the architecture in castles. The engineering and architecture were influenced by the Gothic architectural style. The Gothic architectural style emerged during the Middle Ages, from the 12th to 16th century. It was used mostly in the construction of religious and institutional buildings. Gothic architecture is characterized by the pointed arch, ribbed vault, large windows, and buttresses. It was an original style that evolved from the Romanesque. The beauty of Gothic architecture appealed to emotion and faith or civic pride. The main public structure in most communities was the church, and entire communities often participated in cathedral construction, which took multiple generations to build. The Chartres Cathedral in France embodies the most definitive features of Gothic architecture. Many of these features would eventually be reflected in the Brooklyn Bridge. The cathedral's ribbon-paneled vaults call to mind the strength of the bridge's pointed arches. Intricate lines in the stained glass at Chartres seem as complex as the cables in Brooklyn. Centuries after Gothic architecture first peaked, the world saw a rise in architectural historicism. Architects began appropriating old architectural details and ideas in order to embody historic styles in new buildings. By the beginning of the 19th century, European architecture was also becoming pluralistic, incorporating neoclassical, Indian, Egyptian, and Moorish styles. Amongst the historic styles used by the 19th century architects was the Gothic revival. Gothic was used for churches, additions to old Gothic institutions, and country homes. The Gothic revival came about during the 1740s in England and then gained momentum in the 19th century. This rebirth moved away from the neoclassical influences of the period. Features of neo-Gothic architecture include prominent vertical lines, pointed windows, great height in structure, carvings, decorative tracery, pinnacles, and gargoyles. In 1826, Augustus Pugin wrote contrasts or parallel between the noble edifices of the Middle Ages and similar buildings of the present day. Pugin believed that the 14th century Gothic was superior to modern building because Gothic society outshined the contemporary industrial world in its humaneness and faith. Pugin was pushing for a reversion to his faith-centered society. The German, French, and English considered Gothic architecture an important part of their national heritages. Cologne Cathedral, Notre Dame, and the Palace of Westminster show how three buildings can elicit such strong connections to different countries despite being rooted in the same historical context. At the time of the Gothic revival, architects were drawing inspiration from further away than ever before, both in time and geographical location. One such architect was John Roebling. Having studied in Germany in the 1820s, Roebling would have been exposed to the early Gothic revival in Northern Europe. This exposure would influence his projects, including the Brooklyn Bridge. 19th century immigrants brought their national sentiments with them to the U.S., often struggling to reconcile their past with their new American identities. Those who held on to their religious backgrounds found Gothic cathedrals in the U.S. where they could practice their faith. Those who were interested in art or literature found that many works from the time featured Gothic settings. The Gothic revival had a strong influence on the aesthetics of the Brooklyn Bridge. The bridge features massive stone towers that mimic the masonry of Gothic churches and cathedrals. Gothic designs typically feature intricate ornamental details like those of the Brooklyn Bridge's railings. One of the aesthetic cornerstones of Gothic technology is simply height, awe-inspiring and evocative to demonstrate the majesty of the work. This is evident with the Brooklyn Bridge and its tall, sweeping columns and suspensions. In order to view the whole thing, a spectator must look up in turn, marveling at the grandeur of the structure. In addition to having been influenced by the design aspect of the Gothic revival, the Brooklyn Bridge also drew on its technological aspects. The anchorages were a significant design that illustrated the bridge's grandeur. Buttresses mirrored the anchorages of the bridge, though one used tension and the other compression. During the Gothic period, cathedrals were usually the center, as well as often the biggest buildings in cities. These massive cathedrals functioned to bring society together through worship and mass. They would attract visitors from other cities that wanted to visit the cathedral in order to see the grand architecture and art while worshiping. The fact that the Brooklyn Bridge, a secular piece of infrastructure, was now one of the biggest and busiest places in New York City showed a change in the values of society. Rather than being brought together by religion, people were brought together by roads for the sake of economic opportunity. Roads eased travel from the suburbs of Brooklyn to New York City where people could work or buy goods. It also signified a shift in man's way of thinking about strength and power. During the time where religion dominated society, men gathered to praise God and assumed he possessed the power to affect their lives. Once the bridge was built, men would gather to ogle at the power of man by seeing the massive bridge built by men that could hold the weight of thousands at one time. Gothic architecture predated the Brooklyn Bridge by several centuries. Buildings like the Chartres Cathedral incorporated stone masonry, pointed arches, and flying buttresses, elements that appeared either aesthetically or technologically in Roebling's design. Though these features had previously been reserved for religious structures, their use in the bridge signified a cultural shift. God was no longer the center of community and spiritual life, but was instead replaced by money, modernity, and technological innovation.